of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Funerals continue in Newtown, Connecticut after Friday's shooting rampage that left 20 students and 6 staff members dead at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. 4 more children were laid to rest Wednesday, as well as the principal of the school, Dawn Hochsprung, and teacher Victoria Soto. Soto died while shielding her students from gunfire. She was remembered by a friend after her memorial service.
She was one of the most beautiful people, like the really super popular person, but she was friendly with everyone. Like, she did not have a mean bone in her body, always smiling and laughing, and you could hear her down the hallway. She was a great person. So this is just such a tragic loss, and we were going to have our 10-year high school reunion next year, and I was really looking forward to seeing her and seeing everyone again, and quite the damper on things.
Meanwhile, President Obama announced Wednesday he would appoint a new White House-led effort chaired by Vice President Joe Biden to reform gun control policies, which he would outline in his annual State of the Union address next month.
The fact that we can't prevent every act of violence doesn't mean we can't steadily reduce the violence and prevent the very worst violence. That's why I've asked the Vice President to lead an effort that includes members of my cabinet and outside organizations to come up with a set of concrete proposals no later than January, proposals that I then intend to push without delay. This is not some Washington commission. This is not something where folks are going to be studying the issue for 6 months and publishing a report that gets read and then pushed aside. This is a team that has a very specific task to pull together real reforms right now.
President Obama also referred to the ongoing toll from gun violence around the country since Friday's attack.
Since Friday morning, a police officer was gunned down in Memphis, leaving 4 children without their mother. 2 officers were killed outside a grocery store in Topeka. A woman was shot and killed inside a Las Vegas casino. 3 people were shot inside an Alabama hospital. A 4-year-old was caught in a drive-by in Missouri and taken off life support just yesterday. Each one of these Americans was a victim of the everyday gun violence that takes the lives of more than 10,000 Americans every year. Violence that we cannot accept as routine.
Well, to talk more about the factors leading to gun violence from Newtown, Connecticut to the streets of cities like Chicago, where the homicide rate spiked earlier this year, more than 500 gun murders in the past year, and also behind closed doors in cases of domestic violence, we're joined by Goldie Taylor. She lost both her father and her brother to gun violence. She's an MSNBC contributor and managing editor of the Goldie Taylor Project. She recently wrote a piece entitled, "After My Father and Brother Were Murdered, Owning a Gun Made Me Feel Secure. Now it's time to give it up." And she did just that on Monday. Goldie Taylor, welcome to Democracy Now! Let's go back a ways, how you ended up getting your gun. Tell us your life story.
You know, I grew up with guns, Amy. It was a part of our life. We grew up in East St. Louis, and so having a gun was really a part of the family security, along with having burglar bars and those kinds of things. When my father was murdered in 1973, my mother immediately bought a gun and kept it in the house for, you know, all of our lives. My brother was murdered in a similar fashion about 20 years later, and it really took the family by storm. At that time, I bought my own gun. I did not want my sons to live the fate or end in the fate that my father and brother had. And so I did what I thought I needed to do to protect them. I had been a former Marine, and so I had weapons training. My stepfather had been a detective sergeant at the East St. Louis Police Department, and so, you know, it was natural to me to have a weapon in the house. But over the years, you know, I've just come to understand that having a privately owned, even though legal, weapon in your home, you are more likely to hurt yourself or someone that you care about than you are to hurt someone who is trying to hurt you from the outside. And so those are, the real statistics. But we've got a real dilemma here. My father and brother were murdered with illegal guns, and this country is awash in them. The black market is just, inundated, from Los Angeles to New York, Chicago, of course, Atlanta, where young men of color, are using these guns on each other, and as a consequence, also hurting children surrounding them. And so the University of Chicago says that 1 in 5 children who are hit by gunfire are not the intended target. There was a little girl in Chicago on her mother's lap having her hair combed one warm evening in Chicago. She was shot by a stray bullet. And that is the tragedy in this country. Something about Newtown really brings this, home for many people who aren't impacted by violence on a daily basis. But I turned my gun in, and I've watched and listened as others turn theirs in, and I'm glad that it's beginning to happen. Some of these cities have had record buyback programs over the last 72 to 96 hours, and I'm really proud of that. I'm glad that we're going to have a conversation about gun control in this country. I'm glad we're going to have a conversation, I think, finally, about mental health and access to it. I'm really glad that we're going to have, I believe, a conversation holistically about, just our violent culture in general. It's in our popular culture. It's in our popular media.
Well, Goldie Taylor, I wanted to ask you about that, particularly the culture of the country, because as you say, the illegal gun problem is a bigger problem in the inner city, but clearly in the suburbs of America, in the heartland of America, many folks with legal guns also sometimes engage in some of these many of these violent acts. And as we're having the conversation for those who are turning their guns in, there's also a section of the American people who are clinging desperately to this idea of their right to continue to have guns and not even assault weapons. In the Connecticut case, for instance, the mother trained her children in the use of guns, and many Americans do that, continue to train their children in the use of guns from an early age. Could you talk a little bit more about the culture of violence in America from your perspective?
I think that I believe in the Second Amendment. But as the president said, there is an awfully large gap between having the right to bear arms, as it's stated in the Second Amendment, and then being able to own an assault rifle. I think that there are, being former military, I think that there are certain kinds of weaponry that civilians simply should not have access to. There are certain kinds of ammunition that civilians should not have access to. I don't know why a civilian would need, for instance, a hollow point bullet, those things that are armor piercing. That is something that we ought to be able to severely regulate. But, I do believe that people ought to be able to have, for instance, a shotgun if you're living in rural America for home protection. If you choose to do that, it's your right. I don't happen to want to choose it for myself anymore. But the idea that we as Americans have a right to assault rifles, that we have a right to, armor-piercing bullets, I think that that is simply a fallacy. I think the Supreme Court has ruled that the individual right to bear arms for home self-protection, is something that is settled law for them. But what is, I think widely open, we regulate things like Sudafed. I can't buy but so much of it, and I have to go to my pharmacist and have it, I can't buy it off the shelf anymore. Why is it that I can get online and order a Bushmaster, or order a Beretta or a 9mm Glock? Why is it that I can go to a gun show and not have a background check or show appropriate identification and buy a gun? 40% of the guns in this country, both rural and urban, are bought without appropriate background checks. There are so many loopholes in our gun law, and we simply have to close them.
We're talking to Goldie Taylor, and we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to ask you about your own personal experiences with domestic violence and guns. And let's talk more about the inner cities. What deaths count and what don't? The horror that we see in Newtown, should it be a model for how the media covers all murders in this country? Stay with us. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.